Imagine a law school problem question. A statute states, it is an offense to wear red socks in a public place. Albert is caught on campus wearing a maroon sock as a hat. Is he liable? We immediately hit a wall. What exact shade defines red? Does wearing a sock on your head count? Is a university a public place? Parliament writes statutes to govern society, but language is imprecise. Drafters cannot anticipate every real-world scenario. This ambiguity creates a direct constitutional tension. In the UK, Parliament is the supreme lawmaker. Elected officials in the House of Commons hold the democratic mandate to create legislation. Judges, however, are appointed. Their role is to apply the law, not draft it. But when a statute's wording is ambiguous, when red socks means several things, the judiciary must intervene. To resolve these ambiguities without overstepping their role, UK courts rely on an objective, step-by-step cognitive algorithm rather than personal preference. This flowchart outlines the English legal system's four-step workflow used to derive binding meaning from ambiguous text. The process begins with strict grammatical construction, expands outward to evaluate context and heuristics, and finally measures against common law presumptions. Relying on this specific sequence demonstrates a practitioner's technical proficiency when answering a problem question. This approach signals to an examiner that you understand the transition in the English courts from strict formal literalism to a modern objective-oriented law. Step 1 of the algorithm requires judges to start with the grammatical and literal meaning of the words. This is the literal rule. Words are given their plain, ordinary meaning. If the text is clear, the court must apply it, even if the outcome appears harsh or undesirable. We see the limits of this rule in the 1868 case of Whiteley v. Chappell. The defendant was charged with impersonating a person entitled to vote. The issue was that the individual he impersonated was dead. On a literal construction, a deceased individual is not a person entitled to vote. The court reached the reluctant conclusion that the defendant could not be convicted. It is a clear example of how strict literalism can actively defeat the intention of Parliament. To rescue literal interpretations from producing total absurdity, the courts developed the Golden Rule. A notable application is the 1872 case of R. v. Allen regarding the offense of bigamy. Section 57 made it an offense if a married person shall marry another person. Strictly speaking, a person who is already married cannot legally marry a second time. That second marriage is legally void. Therefore, a literal reading makes the offense impossible to commit. The court avoided this by interpreting marry as going through the ceremony of marriage. While these rules are foundational, stopping at step 1 in a modern assessment ignores the reality of how judges now operate. Step 2 moves beyond the dictionary definition to consider the broader context and the purposive approach. This diagram shows the shift in judicial thinking. On the left, the historical Mischief Rule required judges to look backward to the common law, identifying the specific defect to implement Parliament's intended remedy. On the right, the modern Purposive Approach looks forward. It identifies the overarching social aim of the legislation, allowing the court to apply the statute to new scenarios. A major example of this is the 2003 decision in Quinta Valle. The 1990 Act defined an embryo as a live human embryo where fertilization is complete. The question was whether this covered cloned embryos created through cell nuclear replacement, which does not involve fertilization. Parliament could not have named cloning in 1990 because the science did not yet exist. However, the House of Lords identified that the broad aim was to regulate all embryos created outside the human body. By focusing on the statute's true purpose, the court ruled that cloned embryos were subject to regulation, bypassing the literal requirement for fertilization. For your analysis, keep these distinct. The Mischief Rule is a historical patch. The Purposive Approach is an intent-driven mandate. To ensure the Purposive Approach doesn't become subjective, Step 3 uses mechanical rules of language and extrinsic aids to anchor the interpretation. The courts use 3 core heuristics: Noscitur sociis, where words draw meaning from their neighbors; Ejusdem generis, where general words following a specific list are restricted to that type; and Expressio unius, where mentioning one thing excludes others. Ejusdem generis was central to the case of Wood v. Commissioner of Police of the Metropolis. The defendant was carrying a piece of broken glass. The statute banned being armed with any gun, pistol, hanger, cutlass, bludgeon, or other offensive weapon. Was broken glass an other offensive weapon? Under the Ejusdem generis rule, general words following a list must be of the same type. The specific items listed, guns, pistols, cutlasses, are all items manufactured specifically as weapons. Broken glass was not manufactured for that purpose. Therefore, it failed the test and was excluded from the scope of the statute. Step 3 also involves extrinsic aids, such as using Hansard to read parliamentary debates. Under Pepper v. Hart, this is only permitted if the statute is ambiguous and the material consists of clear statements by a minister. These rules provide the judiciary with objective tests, ensuring that the final interpretation is based on logic rather than personal preference. We reach the final phase of the algorithm. Step 4. Presumptions. The common law applies certain defaults, such as the presumption against a statute having retrospective effect, or the requirement of mens rea, a guilty mind, as seen in Sweet v. Parsley. Rebutting these defaults requires strong evidence. Parliament must provide explicit, clear language within the statute to prove it intended to depart from these common law baselines. However, the most significant modern overwrite is Section 3 of the Human Rights Act 1998. Its impact is best illustrated by the 2002 case of R.V.A. The literal wording of the Youth Justice and Criminal Evidence Act 1999 banned defendants from using specific evidence. The defendant argued this absolute ban threatened his Article 6 right to a fair trial. Section 3 of the HRA requires courts to read legislation in a way that is compatible with convention rights, wherever possible. Consequently, the House of Lords effectively read new words into the statute to bypass the literal ban and allow the evidence. This creates a significant tension for high-level legal analysis. Section 3 compels courts to stretch interpretation to the absolute limit, which often blurs the line between interpreting the law and making it. This schema summarizes the practitioner's algorithm, from literal meaning and purposive context to rules of language and presumptions. Throughout this process, judges must decode parliamentary intent without overstepping into the role of the legislator. This interpretive flexibility is what allows statutes drafted in the 19th century to effectively govern a 21st century society. Demonstrating this precise, evolving framework in an answer validates a professional grasp of the mechanics of UK constitutional law.